I raised my sister's kids for 5 years for free, but the day she called me a useless burden, everything changed. I remember the exact syllable, the slow way she said it, as if she were tasting the word to make sure it stuck. In that moment, my chest tightened, not with anger, but with a cold clarity I had not felt in decades. All those years of folding tiny laundry, of driving to soccer practice at dawn, of rearranging my own life around their needs, she had reduced it to one disposable insult. How had kindness become weakness? How had "I'll do anything for family" turned into a line item she felt comfortable erasing? My name is Evelyn, and I am 62 years old. Before I share how they lost everything because of their own greed, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe toxic people always get the karma they deserve. But to understand how they ended up with absolutely nothing, we have to go back to the 5 years I gave away. When I say 5 years, I mean every morning of every week for 5 straight years. My sister Lisa was younger, vivacious, always with a plan for the next weekend escape, a motel in the mountains, a long flight to Florida, and she assumed naturally that I would be at home. I believed family comes first. I believed my life could be rearranged to accommodate her needs. I thought love looked like midday PB and J sandwiches, broken up fights over the toaster, and staying up late to sew missing buttons back on school uniforms. The house she left me each time I took over looked lived in. Cereal boxes, misplaced homework, the same sticky fingerprints on the kitchen island. The first few months I found it endearing. I would wake before dawn and make coffee, chop fruit for school lunches, and check backpacks twice to make sure homework had attached itself to the right folder. I drove them to school when the car wouldn't start, sat through parent-teacher conferences when Lisa was too busy, and sat in waiting rooms as little hands clenched mine during feverish nights. Financially, I was careful. I had a small savings account from a lifetime of thrift and a modest retirement plan, but I never spent it on myself. Instead, I paid for extra school supplies, band instruments, and the odd championship fee because Lisa always said she'd reimburse me when she got her next big client. She never did. Sometimes she'd hand me a 20 and say, "Thanks, Evelyn," in that flippant way she had, like I'd done her a favor. I swallowed gratitude in silence because family, I told myself, deserved more patience. The kids, Jacob 9 and Mia 7, were bright and loud and beautiful. But bright doesn't mean easy. Jacob's homework would be scattered across the coffee table. Mia would refuse to wear clean socks because the pattern didn't feel right. I learned to perform tiny miracles, school projects assembled in the dead of night, backpacks found by the door at 6 a.m., ballet shoes returned from the dryer with the strap mended. My days were an endless list of small rescues. My nights were filled with tucking in, reading the same chapter of the same book until my voice gave out and the quiet whisper of "Good night, Grammy" that kept me going even when I was exhausted. People asked me how I kept up. You make time, I would say. You rearrange, you prioritize. But I didn't see it then as surrender. It felt like love. It felt like purpose. I told myself I was lucky to be needed. I told myself that my sister loved her children, that she was doing her best. And for a while, that half-truth held me together. The subtle slights came next. Lisa began to call only when she needed me, and her thanks started to sound like obligation rather than warmth. When I planned a doctor's appointment for myself, she'd sigh and say, "Can't you reschedule? I need you here." When I asked if I could have one weekend to visit an old friend from work, she laughed, not kindly, but with the sort of small cruelty people use when they test a line you invented between help and burden. I remember the morning I bent over the sink, scrubbing a moldy lunchbox, and realized I hadn't chosen a single pleasure for myself in years. My hands were familiar with the texture of glue sticks and the stubborn tangles of hair ties. My calendar was filled with other people's rehearsal schedules and dentist visits. My own birthday had become a footnote, We'll do something later, a later that never arrived. I swallowed that too because my heart had learned to keep quiet. What I didn't expect was how hollow that quiet would feel when it was met by contempt rather than appreciation. It was a Thursday when I asked for the weekend. I had been invited to an old friend's 60th birthday, someone who had been there when my husband died and who'd seen me through those raw early months. I wanted one weekend to sit at a diner, to drink coffee that wasn't gone cold between school pickups, to laugh like my own person for a while. Lisa was already packing for a short trip, a weekend retreat with friends. She flicked through her makeup palette as I spoke, not looking at me. "A weekend?" she said, as if I'd suggested a crime. "You want a weekend? You do realize I work full-time, Eve. I have a job. I have responsibilities." Her tone was sharp, like a paper cut. I explained gently, "I just want Saturday and Sunday, Lisa. The kids are fine, and I'll be back by Sunday night." Her face hardened in a way I had never seen before. "Fine? They're not fine without you. And anyway, I don't have time to deal with this. Why are you making this complicated?" She folded an airline ticket into her purse and snapped it shut. "Look, I'm tired of begging you, Evelyn. You never take care of your own business. You're like that old sweater nobody wants. You just sit here and take what you can. It's pathetic." Her words landed like stones. "You're pathetic." It was a phrase I would later replay in my head when I packed, when I signed forms, when I chose quiet over chaos. She didn't beg me to stay. She didn't soften it. She weaponized my kindness, assuming, rightfully in her view, that I would apologize and erase my plans. A real betrayal is small, almost domestic. It's a look, a phrase, a reassignment of your worth. Lisa's betrayal was the final escalation of years of taking. She told me she'd call when she got back, like a command that disguised itself as a promise. She used a tone that left no room for negotiation, which was her way of saying, "You will be here, because there is nowhere else you should be." Her arrogance was not loud. It was efficient, like a hand closing around a contract. Later that night, she sent me a text, the kind that meant everything and nothing. "Don't make me regret hiring you so young. This arrangement works for me." I read it twice, finally recognizing the shape of it. Arrangement. Not love, not family. A business transaction where I was always the unpaid intern. "That's when you realized?" friends would ask later. "When she called you pathetic?" No. I had been gathering evidence for years. The insult was merely the point when the balance tipped from hope to cold clarity. I felt small and enormous, both at once. Small because of what she had said, enormous because of what I had been carrying, and the size of the life I could now move toward. She expected tears. She expected me to beg for my place back. She expected to keep everything the same because her life could not bend a fraction. That certainty was her arrogance, and it proved to be the very thing that allowed me to walk away. I didn't scream. I didn't knock over a lamp or throw the cereal like some melodrama. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm and listened to the refrigerator hum. My hands trembled when I packed the weekend bag I'd already bought. The act was small, deliberate, a toothbrush, a cardigan, a photograph of my late husband. I folded them as if they were contracts closing. That night, I called an old colleague who had recommended a retirement community in a small town 2 states away. A place with wide porches, community gardens, and a room with windows that looked out over a field of lupines. It smelled of sunscreen and a little bit of rain when I visited. I liked the sound of the rustling trees. I liked the idea of waking to birds instead of alarms. I signed a lease a week later. I told Lisa I was going to see Mary for a weekend. I didn't tell her I'd changed the locks on my own life. When she texted a frantic, "Where did you put Jacob's soccer cleats?" I sent her a photograph of the cleats, neatly boxed, and wrote, "They're in the attic." I labeled everything. Love, Eve. I chose my words like stitches. Tight, final, careful. Cutting off the unpaid labor was not dramatic. It was administrative. I stopped answering phone calls outside visiting hours. I stopped doing the grocery runs on the way to my house. I rerouted my direct deposit to stop sending money to bills I had been quietly supplementing. I handed Lisa a list of the kids' routines and medical information written in a clear, black ink hand. I gave her resources for childcare centers and a carefully curated list of recommended professional nannies. When she called and demanded one last favor, "Just this one thing, Evelyn. Jake has a test tomorrow," I said with a quiet that surprised both of us. "I'm not your full-time nanny anymore, Lisa. I am your sister. I can visit. I can babysit occasionally, but I can't pick up where you leave off when you jet off for the weekend." There was no shouting, no pleading, just a simple, immovable boundary. Her reaction was venomous. "You can't do this," she said, as if I had engaged in a crime rather than reclaimed my life. "You don't have the right to interfere with my family." I was calm. "No, Lisa," I replied. "I do. I have the right to protect my peace." I packed a small truck with everything I owned and drove 2 states away at dawn. The road was long, and as the miles fell away, so did a weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. I thought about all the Saturdays I'd missed, all the birthdays that had been postponed for later, all the dinners where I'd been asked to do just one more thing. The world was quieter. In the back of the truck, painting canvases slid against a blanket. I'd brought my oil paints because the idea of capturing a sky felt like reclamation. The first night in the retirement community, I sat on the porch under the shine of a street lamp and cried. Not the drowning kind of cry, but a steady release, like a faucet finally opened after being tightly shut for years. I had left in a dignified hush. The tears were private, and they tasted like something both old and new. They washed out fear and left room for decision. I didn't show my decision as revenge. I showed it as a refusal. I refused to foot someone else's emotional and financial bill. When I told myself I would withdraw, I also decided to be compassionate with myself. I bought a calendar and wrote my name on days. Simple appointments that were for me alone. Painting morning, library visit, lunch with Mary. It was astonishing how filling those small letters felt. The boundary was complete when the mail forwarding paperwork arrived, and I redirected anything labeled responsible for childcare back to Lisa. I felt a peculiar freedom in that signature, like a lock clicking into place. It was not vindictive, it was necessary. Life, as it turns out, has its own sense of balance. Once I removed my consistent presence, the unpaid labor, the invisible patching and mending, the dominoes began to fall. It wasn't theatrical. It was procedural and pitiless. The first sign was the nannies. Lisa, in panic, hired a string of expensive professional sitters, each with glossy resumes and polite smiles. They arrived armed with boundless patience and corporate sense schedules. They lasted a week. Jacob would refuse to listen, and Mia would cry without being able to say why. The nannies could not navigate the history of a house run on unspoken rules. They would call me, apologetic and exhausted, asking for small tips like the place where the kids hid their crayons or which flavor of cereal they preferred. I didn't respond. I had already decided the work would not be mine to refill. The nannies quit one by one, citing mismatch in expectations or unsafe conditions. Lisa, suddenly without easy labor, found her mornings swallowed by chaos. She'd been used to walking out the door with both kids prepped and lunches made. And here, without me, there were shoes missing, backpack straps tied together, and homework alerts unread on her phone. Her employer began to notice. She started being late. She would rush into meetings with hair askew or return from a lunch break with a voicemail that said, "We need someone who can keep a regular schedule." Her manager, a woman named Karen, called her in for a meeting one Wednesday. "We've received too many missed deadlines this quarter," Karen said, calm and factual. We value your expertise, but we need reliability. If you need to take leave or work different hours, we can discuss options, but we cannot continue to deliver inconsistent results. I watched the texts rolling through my phone in the weeks following, terse, panicked messages that read like confessions. Then came the financial slips. Lisa had been skirting bills for a while, relying on the small amounts I would put in when I noticed an overdue notice. Without that invisible top-up, her credit card interest spiked. One letter I received, a forwarded notice from someone who had been on our shared account in a past life, mentioned something about payment demands and collections. She began to sell things, expensive jewelry, a second car, in the hope of plugging holes. Pride in that household was measured by vacations, and once the money frayed, so did the illusion. The kids bore the immediate brunt. The school called. There were notes about late homework and a voicemail asking for emergency contact confirmation. Mia's teacher left a message that made me want to rush there despite everything. Mia seems anxious. She's drawing the same houses over and over. Jacob missed tryouts because a carpool never arrived. I received a single photograph of him sitting on a curb, cleats in hand, the team running drills in the distance. The message was small, a tiny life slippage, but it accumulated. And then the demotion. The company where Lisa worked announced internal restructuring, and because of her record of tardiness and missed deliverables, she was moved into a less visible role. It was a technicality dressed in corporate language, but it felt like public humiliation to her. She had been coasting on an arrangement that assumed invisible support. When that support vanished, the edifice proved illusory. Through it all, she texted me. At first, the tone was furious. "You ruined us," she wrote one night. Later, messages shifted to frantic. "Please, Eve, they won't stay. The kids are out of control. People are quitting. I'm trying." I read them and felt nothing like triumph. There was a hollow in me that recognized the cost. The children, again, were the ones who suffered. But I had given so much that I finally understood my own limits. There was a difference between love and self-erasure, and that difference was a line I had crossed back into safety. Karma, in this case, wasn't a lightning bolt. It was a series of unfolding failures born of neglect. Lisa had assumed I would always absorb the consequences of her choices. Once the absorber was gone, those consequences reasserted themselves. It was like removing a keystone from an arch. The structure didn't collapse in one dramatic fold. It surrendered piece by piece. I would get messages in the evening when the house was quiet in my new town and the sun fell warm across my palate. "My job is at risk. They keep quitting." The landlord called. Then a photograph that made my chest drop, a foreclosure notice pinned to a community board. I didn't orchestrate any of it. I didn't gloat. But there was a deep, wordless justice in seeing the unsustainability of a life built on other people's unpaid care finally unspool. I had imagined, foolishly perhaps, that when the mess finally crashed down, there would be a climactic, tearful apology. I imagined Lisa on her knees, hands outstretched, begging to be forgiven. What arrived was different. A series of texts that alternated between blame and bargaining. "I didn't realize how much you did," one said. "I was under so much stress," another read. "Please come back. We can work this out. I'll pay you this time." When she came, because of course she came, it was not at my door, but to a neighbor who knew I would be home painting. She rang the bell and stood on my porch, flustered. Up close, she looked smaller than the woman who had packed holidays and commanded the family rhythms. There were no dramatic speeches. She held out an envelope of cash, too little and too late. "Evelyn," she said, voice trembling, not with apology, but with a pleading I had never granted her as leverage. "I can't believe I let it go this far. I'm sorry. I don't expect you to come back fully, but just for a few hours each week, we'll pay you. I interrupt myself in memory, because this is what I remember saying exactly. "Lisa, I love you. I will not be put back into a position where my life disappears into someone else's convenience. I won't take money from you as if it solves the problem of years of taking." My words were measured and kind because my dignity didn't need a pound of sarcasm. It needed clarity. She began to cry. It was not a dramatic audition of regret. It was the sound of someone realizing the cost of their choices. "Please," she whispered. "They're scared. They miss you." I thought about the kids, their small faces in the pictures that had crossed my phone, the way Mia had once clutched my hand under the table and asked if we could bake cookies every Friday. I had not abandoned them. I had moved into a healthier orbit. I could visit. I could buy paints for Mia. I could sign up for a weekend at the community center where Jacob could try soccer again. But I would not reabsorb my life into the vortex that had almost swallowed me. "My answer is no," I told her gently. "But I will help them find stability. I'll sign up for one Saturday a month as a respite. I'll pay for a tutor if you can't manage homework right now. I will not be your safety net again." She begged, bargaining for anything: money, time, a return. I held firm. I counseled gently about professional childcare, about therapy for the kids to help with the anxiety that had surfaced. It felt like a clinical administration of care rather than the old, reflexive sacrifice. I was no longer the default. In the weeks after, Lisa tried to rebuild. She was battered by consequences and had to confront a truth she had avoided. You cannot run a household and a career on the labor of one unpaid person without consequences. She was human, and human beings sometimes learn only through pain. There were times I felt sympathy for her, but that didn't mean I would let my boundaries dissolve. As for me, I began to paint in the afternoons. The mornings belonged to me. Slow coffee, a walk through the community garden where tomatoes and basil leaned in polite rows, and then the studio room where the light spilled across a table. I painted landscapes at first, fields of lupines and ridgelines, because they held a kind of patience. A landscape doesn't demand anything from you except time. You watch the colors change and learn how to stand with a scene. Sometimes a text would slide into my phone, small and clumsy. "Are you okay?" from Lisa. "We miss you," from Jacob. A scribbled voice memo of, "Hi, Grammy." I replied on my terms. I scheduled a Saturday a month, and I kept it sacred. We baked cookies when we met. We talked about old songs and new feelings. I taught Mia how to mix a sky color and Jacob how to lay in a shadow. I loved them without being swallowed. There were moments when people, neighbors, and new friends in the retirement community would ask, "Are you sure you don't want to go back?" I would look at my hands, stained with paint and sunlight, and say no. I had spent years giving the best of myself for free and being called pathetic for it. I had learned an important lesson. Giving is sacred only when it is a choice, not a chain. To this day, when Lisa's messages come in frantic, I answer with calm. When she asks for money to plug a hole, I say no and offer alternatives. When she tries to shame me with the phrase she once used, I remind myself of the porch light the night I left. A small warm glow, steady and honest. I repeat the boundary like a mantra. I will not vanish for others' convenience. The final act of my story is quiet. There is no dramatic confrontation, no last-minute reconciliation that erases everything. Instead, there is a scene I will describe because it feels like the centerpiece of every healing story I have ever known. A late afternoon light on my easel, the smell of oil paint and varnish, and a small square of canvas that captures a sky that seems newly possible. My tea cools beside me, and a breeze moves the blinds. I can hear children playing in the distance from a neighbor's yard, a sound that is both familiar and now distant enough to allow me to breathe. I will not forgive the erasure of my life as a neat transaction. Forgiveness is not a demand. It is a gift I may give if and when it is sincere. For now, I have refused to be the woman who disappears. I have reclaimed my rhythms. I have taken back my Saturdays, and in that reclaimed time, I have discovered a peace that is not silence, but clarity. So if you are watching this and you recognize the slow burn of being taken for granted, know that your boundaries are not selfish, they are survival. You can step back without being cruel. You can choose dignity without it being punishment. And sometimes the quiet withdrawal of love and labor is the most devastating and the most healing form of justice. Thank you for sitting with me. Tell me where you are watching from below. If this story touched something in you, subscribe to protect your peace.